Thank you for joining us. This is another episode of the ARCA's Fireside Chat addressing ESG. Today we have Sheila Warren from the World Economic Forum. Thanks for joining us, Sheila.
Thanks for having me, Rain. It's great to be here.
Fantastic. Would you mind telling us a little bit about yourself and just how you and the forum look at ESG?
Sure. Yeah. So I am the head of our entire blockchain digital assets crypto data division over here at the forum. Also deputy head of what we call our Center for the Fourth Industrial Revolution, which is kind of lofty, but basically it's about exploring the enabling environment in which a number of different technologies, blockchain being one of them, but also AI and devices and space tech and other things are kind of coming together to create a new world, a new society. So ESG is critical to that as technology begins to become even more and more prominent, and as human-computer interaction becomes more and more difficult to discern where the boundaries are, and all kinds of boundaries being blurred here. We're seeing more and more usage of energy, of different kinds of components, of different kinds of needs that weren't as prominent in previous versions of our human lifespans, right? So even in our lifetime. So I think ESG is a critical component because we have a responsibility to make sure that while we celebrate the advances these technologies are bringing to us, we're also being responsible about their deployment and making sure that there is actually future generations, a planet for future generations, to actually enjoy.
We couldn't agree more on that point. I think definitely that's the whole point of this. It's really fascinating to see how the forum has embraced looking at all these technologies and how they integrate it into like their ESG narrative and how people are thinking about it. How does digital assets fit into that spectrum? And how does something like that, it's a new and evolving thing. How do you get into like that consideration metrics of the forum?
That's such a great question. So we're actually launching something called the Crypto Impact and Sustainability Accelerator. And that's really predicated on the idea, which I know you share, that the E is just one part of this. It gets a lot of the airtime. In some ways, I think that's because it's the easiest one for people outside the space to understand. Energy is used or it's not, and that has consequences in these ways or not, right? And there's at least a perception you can make comparisons about this energy usage and that energy usage, which my view is those aren't helpful, but nevertheless, they can be made. The governance part of this is where I'm obsessed with crypto governance. I think it's like one of the most fascinating things happening in society today, just in the way it's global, the way it's ajurisdictional, the empowerment, the focus on kind of user empowerment and agency that at least is embedded in the potential of the protocol, even if that doesn't always manifest. So in my mind, when we think about ESG and digital assets, we have to examine the digital assets are a different way of engaging within an ecosystem. Not just the financial ecosystem, but really any ecosystem. And what they provide, again, I'm speaking very, very high level here, this isn't always true, but what they can provide, let's say more accurately, is again, a more equitable allocation of risk and reward in any given system. So in addition to the ESG work the forum has, we have a whole division here focused on what the term that the forum coined, stakeholder capitalism. And this idea that rather than just extractive capitalism, where there are very clear winners and losers, where the entire orientation of an enterprise is around benefiting a particular set of people, more than others, and it's just understood. There is a way of thinking about the stakeholder set. And I would say I include externalities like the environment, in that stakeholder set. And you can do that if you connect in via crypto governance models or new crypto economic models, some of this concept of stakeholder engagement with the concept of ESG and marry all those different ideas.
That's really fascinating. And I love when you talk about the governance piece. And I think in digital assets, it's overlooked. When we talk, there's a huge amount of focus on the E, but I also think in overall ESG, the E takes up a lot of the space, like you say, it's easy to compare, although sometimes we think these comparisons are not necessarily helpful, but people can wrap their heads around it.
Right.
Exactly. But when you talk about digital assets, you hit it right on the head. This is really, in my mind, a technology about decentralized decision-making, disaggregating that type of power to more democratic modes. So that's really the value proposition or potential value proposition of a fully realized digital asset ecosystem. How's that message being received by your audience? Because it's still kind of a little bit nebulous, right? We have this idea of tremendous governance and decentralized governance, but in reality, it's still, very messy. We're still working all of this out. It's happening in public. How do like forum members, when you talk about the governance side of this, how's that being received?
I may speak with very prominent people in various ecosystems, but they are also human. And so our human tendency is to kind of try to compartmentalize things and compare them to things that we know. So there's a reason that I think the speculative aspects of Bitcoin, for example, are fairly well understood, I think, by many significant players outside of the crypto ecosystem, right? Because there is a model, whether or not that model is accurate or ports 100% over is a matter of great debate, but there's at least a model for understanding it. There is really no model for crypto governance. So a lot of people, they get that there's something there, and we certainly talk about it when it's appropriate. But I don't know that there isn't something you can compare it to. And so there is, I think, the recognition that, there are other, like, people are doing things on Discord or Reddit or what's going on, what's this kind of, and certainly organizing is something that is understood. So you go all the way back to Occupy, and people kind of get like, there's these grassroots things being organized. The connection I don't think that's been made is just the value, like the literal financial value that is now held. So Occupy, what was one of the problems with Occupy? There was a funding issue around Occupy. There was a longevity issue around Occupy. There was a weather, frankly, issue around some aspects of Occupy, right? Like there are a bunch of reasons why that wound up where it was. When you think about taking that digitally, and you think about the tremendous financial resource behind some of these things, that connection, I don't think, has been made by most people that are paying relative attention to the space. And so, it's not one that we are necessarily emphasizing because, to your point, I think there's a lot more that needs to happen here with maturation of these spaces. And right now, what you're seeing is a lot of times being very centralized that people can understand, that is then transitioning to decentralized modeling. And no one really, that's messy, to your point. It isn't happening cleanly. It's certainly not complete. It comes with its own hiccups. And so we feel it's not quite at the point where this is something that we would want a lot of attention on because it's early. But I do think that some of the actors who have the time to pay more attention to this understand that there is something here that their heads are not going to easily get around. And it's going to be really brand new and open up a whole new way of, to your point, democratizing assets, democratizing the holding of value and the transfer of value that we haven't seen before in our lifetimes.
Completely agree. And I think you bring up a really important point there. It's about kind of narrative and understanding and education. Where do you think like your members are? We have a lot of awareness, like you say, around Bitcoin and at least the value proposition that, or people understand that this idea of these other assets. And then you talk not even just the governance aspect or certain like nuances of them. What do you think the awareness is for more traditional people that, like you say, aren't crypto native, that are more of the traditional world, that are looking at this, they're interested in this is a fintech evolution, potentially societally changing, but not sure. Where do you think the awareness and understanding is, not even on the governance side, but there's digital assets as an ecosystem, there's this huge attention on Bitcoin, and then what do you think the awareness and understanding is of even the value proposition on all the other things that are going on in the rest of digital assets?
It's a spectrum, unsurprisingly. I think there are some actors that have probably surprising to the crypto ecosystem, to players in crypto, have a very sophisticated understanding of this stuff. They know it actually as well as anybody else, I would say. And then there's some who have jumped to conclusions, perhaps, and maybe have taken a point of view, and it's harder, I suppose, to get evidence in front of them. And that's like anything. I think that you see the same thing, any faction within crypto. There's those who are like in their point of view and that's it, and you're not moving them. And there's those who are more open-minded or who have a more curious mindset and want to learn. So I would say that awareness of Bitcoin is 100%. And at this point, everyone, I don't know where you've been hiding if you don't know, I would say is similar. I think there's a universal understanding that there's something called a non-fungible token. Whether anyone knows what that is or not, they at least are aware that that is a thing. I would say that's pretty universal awareness. I don't think most people have ever heard of DAOs, or if they have, they just think of them as some technical thing that's unrelated to the other thing. I don't think that connection is well known, except again, among this kind of, that there are technologists within a lot of these different places, right? Traditional actors have technologists that work with them or around them. And so they tend to have a much deeper understanding of some of these things. The governance, I think, has just escaped. I don't think people understand it.
Right.
Or if they do pay attention to it, it's more that it's a threat because there's no accountability, which I think is an interesting point. It's not unfair to say there isn't really accountability. It's a different kind of accountability, right? But that is not necessarily seen as a positive, the way I think crypto actors see it as a positive. So it's a spectrum like anything else. You know, I do think there's a tendency to assume a monolithic orientation. So CBDC is seen by many as like, this is a CBDC, this is what it is and what it isn't. And of course, we know there's a tremendous differentiation, right? Same things with stablecoins, same thing with crypto. There are all kinds of different ways of engaging in digital assets. I think there tends to be a tendency, and this is again probably human, to elide the nuance. And we think the nuance is critically important. These things are not the same. There are design choices that go into them that result in different outcomes, right? All of that. I think that is largely lost. But an understanding at least of conceptually what these things are, I would say that's fairly universal at this point.
Okay. This is interesting. We were on a panel together and talking with you, and I really resonate with kind of your approach here of a very even-handed approach. We're trying to approach it similarly. There's a lot of nuance in these discussions. I really want people to come to their own conclusions around ESG. I'm not claiming whether digital assets are good ESG or bad ESG, but I think if you look at it, it's hard to deny that there are components of digital assets that at least touch on those and however you feel, but they need thoughtful engagement. Do you think our space, the digital asset space, is doing a good job in the way they engage on this? And yes or no, what can be done, or what would you say from touching more traditional world would be some helpful pointers, to how to move the needle in a positive, just engagement sense, in your view?
Yeah, I'm trying to figure out what I respond to that question politely. So I think that the crypto ecosystem, digital asset ecosystem, tends to be very two things. And this is again broad brush, naive about the importance and influence of bringing along outsiders, just as a general, beyond adoption. Because adoption, I think everyone's like yes, 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 but I think there is a huge naivete as to even regulation. What a regulator could come in and do. I said this back in April. People yelled at me. I was like, you need to be paying attention to this. It's important. I think the lawyers in the space obviously, are well advised, but a lot of people just, now they get it, maybe in ways they didn't a couple of weeks ago, right? So different time.
Yeah.
So that's number one. Number two is I think there's also this tendency to be reactive. So, the criticism is, oh, criminals. And so we're like, look at all the ways it's not criminals, or, ransomware, we respond to that, energy usage of proof of work, respond, so it tends to be reactive. And as a result, there aren't a lot of places that are creating a constructive, powerful, coherent, evidence-based, fact-based narrative that's not hypey or shilly or just blatant nonsense, whatever it is. So we've tried to do that. We've tried to be, I started this team, I founded the team here in 2017. I tried to be very consistent. Our approach is, like you say, it's neutral, it's fact-based, it's objective. We're not here to like pump and dump, anything like that, right? We don't buy into hype. We've been saying from the very beginning, to both sides, you're gonna have to find a way to coexist. This is not a situation where one's gonna topple the other, and there's gonna be like, regulators can't regulate crypto out of existence. That's not a thing. Also, I don't think that crypto is going to topple the entire financial system, or we're just going to get, that's gone. I don't think that's, there's going to be a coexisting. So how are we going to do that? How are we going to get to a place where we can create a variety of opportunities? And my entire motivation in this space is what we're talking about right now. It's creating more equitable access. It's empowering users. It's creating agency. It's providing avenues to wealth for those that haven't had that historically. I think those are really important goals. And there is a way of collaborating and constructing this narrative that is not just from crypto to others, but is actually more inclusive even, right? So I think there's two narratives have to be constructed. One is, what would coexistence look like? And what are the benefits of it, right? Who is not being served by this thing? Or is being served, but not in certain ways, right? And how do we acknowledge those failings and accommodate them? Separately, how do we create a narrative within the crypto ecosystem about the benefits it is providing and be honest about some of the risks and challenges, some of which will be mitigated over time as we mature, but which are real. So I think there's just a kind of a lack of, let's call it transparency, haha, right? Like a lack of transparency around what's really going on in terms that can be accessible to people out who are not crypto native.
Yeah, it's a really interesting issue, problem, challenge, opportunity, whatever you want to say. Like when you're talking about a technology or a philosophy or whatever you want to call digital assets or crypto that started as such a small, very targeted like part of the population, super, very specific, but the proposition of what you're doing is actually broad societal change at all levels. And really, the thing that you're talking about isn't really just a technology, it's a narrative and an acceptance of doing things differently. Because sometimes the technology of it is actually quite simple. It's really a mechanism for like distributed decision making, and we now actually have the ability to do it. But now, how do you convince people that you want it to be distributed? And what are the honest value propositions? Like, because not my keys, not my crypto. Okay, great. For somebody that's not used to that proposition, oh, I lost my keys. Let me call the 1-800 number of this. Oh, no, that's gone forever. Oh, interesting.
Where's my password to my helpline? Right. Exactly. I'll wait for 4 hours on hold, right? Yeah, exactly.
Right. Yes, I will take the centralization risk of this. That is something I would choose to forego this type of experience. And I agree with you that this is kind of the business that we're in, is not being dogmatic about this message, understanding that if everybody agrees that adoption is good, you kind of have to have a bit of a broad tent or a big tent approach to this if you're going to want big tent adoption, and to kind of soften the message and make it a little bit more of a dialogue.
Look, I have a lot of respect for people who are just like, anarchy, whatever, right? I mean, I actually have respect for that point of view. I just think that you have to be realistic about, what is your goal? What is your actual goal? And so, I don't have a lot of patience with people whose goal is to make a ton of money. I have no problem with that either. But if that's your only goal, okay, you're probably doing fine. Nothing really needs to change. You just want to be able to like keep doing that. And so you want regulation to kind of enable you to keep doing that, right? Yeah. That's not my goal. I don't think that's the goal of the ecosystem writ large. I choose not to believe that. Now, sometimes it's a bigger lift to choose not to believe that than other days, but in general, that's why I'm in this space. And it's why I really care about it. I think more people care about, creating opportunity than that beyond just themselves and their, wallets, digital or otherwise, than not, right, in this space. And if I ever felt that was not the case, I'd probably do something else with my time. But I genuinely believe that is true. I do think there are a lot of people who really do see very real flaws in the existing system, see the ways it has really not served a lot of people, not necessarily, adjacent to me, but in the world, and you see this, I think, in other places as well. Like the pandemic has spotlighted a lot of this inequity, right? In health access, financial access, all these things they're just facts. So we can pretend they don't exist, but that doesn't make them go away. And so in my mind, it comes down every time to like, what are your goals? What are your actual goals? What are our goals as an ecosystem? And I think because we don't agree on our goals always, that's why the narrative is hard to pull together. And that's why it seems incoherent, because we don't agree. We don't agree not only just as factions by protocol or by whatever, by asset class or whatever it is. We also don't agree within, our own domains, right? Like even within, Bitcoin, for example, there are a lot of different views on it. And so it's hard to come up with a consistent narrative. And so the benefit, I think, of sitting in a role like mine is I sit at a level of abstraction above all of that, where I can kind of start to bring a 10,000 foot, 50,000 foot, 100,000 foot view to some of these things. And I can say to the more TradFi folks, like, this isn't going anywhere. You can hide your head in the sand as long as you want, but you better start paying attention. And I can say to these side, these people, there's probably more openness than you think. There's more understanding of the technology than you're willing to give credit for. And there are ways to kind of build bridges and think about what things remain here and how you create a positive and constructive narrative. But also, it's not a bad thing to acknowledge risks. And if you can be open about that, you're going to get, better guidance, better regulation, which is inevitable, all these things, right? So the last point on this is, I think there's a whole no regulation is the only regulation we'll accept kind of movement, which I have for a long time thought is just okay. Similarly to like, we can hide our heads in the sand over here. Bitcoin, people are just going to stop using Bitcoin and mining it. I mean, that's not a thing. Similarly, we need to fight in no regulation. That's not the thing. So I call it premature regulation. That's the term that I tend to land on, because I do think that most regulation right now is premature. It's not taking into consideration the entirety of the landscape. It will have unintended consequences I think are highly problematic, but I don't think that means that regulation is not appropriate ever in no context and inevitable. I do think those things, but I think that it needs to be very thoughtful, very cautious, and aimed again at the goals that, again, I mean, I recognize these are my goals, but the goals I actually think we share as a society, which are the ones we've articulated during this conversation.
Yeah, I completely agree. And I think a lot of the things that we're identifying and that we're talking about is we're kind of coming from like a command and control, centralized decision making way of doing things and outlook. And this entire technology and value proposition is evolutionary, decentralized, and that. But guess what? When you evolve and things like that, it's not a straight line. Even when you look at like the taxonomy of things, and I think what I've been doing a lot of interest, I think it's interesting, perhaps super dorky and boring, is looking at like kind of the evolution of even the way we look at evolution. If you look at any point in time, people were very certain that it was a certain way. You really have to see how it developed, and it's organic. There was no way to force even something like Darwinian evolution and have people think about it. It was still a narrative that had to replace something else, and people had to agree on it. This has only been going on for 10 years. And, everybody has to realize that there's probably not a way to say, oh, I know that this is the way it's going to go and this is the best way. The whole point of this is that it's actually polling and bringing in divergent thought and having a better way of like sorting.
Totally agree.
But people are like, oh yes, I totally believe in that. And I'm 100% sure that this is the way to go. And I will tell all these people that this is the way it's going to go.
Therefore, yes, I will launch my 10 billion Twitter followers.
Exactly. Interesting. Yes.
Dramatically, I know. I have been heartened to see growth in at least the communication. I'm sure that communication on Twitter, by the time people are, tweeting in a more nuanced manner, they've spent years, getting to that place, right? Because that's not a medium. Unfortunately, it's a medium that we use to drive forward the industry. It isn't always the most productive in some ways, right? Leaving that aside. But one thing I always find very interesting is this idea that the Bitcoin white paper was like, there was no context around it, right? It was like, we had darkness and then there was the Big Bang, and the Big Bang was Satoshi releasing the white. And I'm like, that is an interesting take on events, because I'm like, wow, what about, because you got to give TradFi some credit. I mean, what about e-money? What about, even ATM, going back to ATMs, right? The idea that you weren't going in on engage, like there's been a huge evolution in how we think about financial systems that started in traditional finance. Like it started there. And then, we were able to leverage it within the crypto ecosystem to kind of say, oh, here we can now, amplify and like juice up a lot of that stuff and create a way where we could actually say the old model may make sense in some context, but there's a new model as well that can actually be productive and positive. So I think you're seeing a lot of, there's a reason payments companies are really involved in the sector and in the space in various ways in different parts of the ecosystem. They're paying more or less attention. But I also think you got to give some credit to kind of like digitization of things that happen in the financial system that made any of this even possible. And it's not like there was this big bang moment where this white paper got released and suddenly, that's just not reality. So similarly in cryptography, right? Bitcoin is leveraging decades of cryptography that came before cryptographic innovation and evolution, to your point, and leveraged all of that and like, again, took it and ran with it in a hugely important and interesting way. But nevertheless, it didn't just come out of the blue. So I sometimes find that mythology a little entertaining, but sometimes I think it's very limiting.
I completely agree. And I think that's an excellent point. All of these things are also on a continuum, rely on technology and other experiments. Right. And it relies, like you say, heavily on the way people see the world now and to explain even what you're doing in crypto or digital assets. You're not like just yield farming. I'm just going to say yield farming. That. Oh, it generates interest as these other things do, and it relies on this narrative and shared context. I completely agree. It makes me that thought of the interesting things that are going on in that narrative. What is there anything particularly that a project or just something specifically in the realm of ESG or governance or the E or the S that has you just particularly excited, like right now that you've seen that's just interesting?
Yeah, well, I'm super excited about some of the work that we're embarking on within this CISA initiative, this Crypto Impact Sustainable Accelerator. And so we're sponsoring, we're about to announce this shortly, but I'll give you a preview, which is
Oh my
we're
God, I'm breaking
embarking
news
upon some
on my
area for you.
fireside chat.
And nerdy and dorky, right? Like here we are staying in our core area of nerdy dorkiness. That we want to look at ethnographic research around some of these opportunities, right? So right now, when it comes to adoption, there hasn't been, the reason I think we haven't seen more include, because this whole, let me just predicate this in a different way. The whole narrative that crypto de facto, digital assets de facto address the issues of financial inclusion is false. That is not true. They can address financial inclusion. That is true, right? But there are things that have to happen for that to be true. And in many cases, despite the loud marketing language or whatever that's used, those things have not happened or are only in the process of starting to happen. So I have a lot of frustration around financial inclusion as a talking point when you really look at, it is very clear that the potential is there. And in some cases, it has been realized. We're not surfacing those stories, in part because they happen in geographies that maybe you're not getting the same sexy press attention. But in a lot of cases, the talking point has nothing behind it. And I find that very irresponsible and distasteful. So putting that aside. So what we're trying to do is say, what are the reasons that people are not able to engage with digital wallet in a meaningful way? Like, what are the barriers? And so there's a whole field of study called ethnography that I've now become an amateur enthusiast of, and it creates kind of this modeling around what you do. And so I think that I tend to be very interdisciplinary in my approaches. I'm a lawyer by training, but I did a lot of like sociology, and I'm an economist undergrad and did some research there. So I think bringing together all these different threads is really important to helping us get a real evaluation of how are we going to address some of these challenges, which are going to spur adoption, right? So if you are able to address the addressable market of unbanked or underbanked folks, that's a gigantic market. That alone is going to make the industry. But how are you going to do that? You're not going to get there unless you're oriented and focused on that, unless you really understand that problem space very, very well, which outside of the context of development aid and development banks, no one really does. So that's something that we're really excited about. I'm excited to see some of the accountability metrics, less the measurement metrics, but more the I guess measurement metrics is redundant, but less the measurement aspect, but how that measurement will lead to accountability in decarbonization and things like this. I think that's exciting to me because, again, putting things on chain gives you a different way of creating and holding people or protocol accountable, right? Which we don't really have in other places. So I find that really exciting. And of course, as I mentioned, I'm just absolutely obsessed with crypto governance. I'm really curious to see how the law and DAOs continue to interact or intersect and what kind of emerges there. So, but I mean, there's so much stuff. It's just if you ask me tomorrow, I'd have a different answer, but these tend to be consistently what I'm spending a lot of my reading and dreaming
time on. That's perfect. And I think that really stimulates thought. And the part that I pick up on there, especially for our group and also just discourse in general, is I don't know if it's energized by the pandemic, but this stridence, like that any sort of engagement, like you say, the prospect or the potential of this technology is so equality-based, does all of these things, all of this, but like you say, mainly on the potential side of the equation right now. In actuality, these are some of the things that are happening. And there seems to be a resistance to or that makes your argument invalid by doing that. And you see this almost across all spheres, not just digital assets. I'm more familiar with it here, that any sort of like concession on an argument or point is some sort of like failing. I find the opposite. It gives you more credibility. If you recognize that certain things haven't happened, but really engage with them honestly, that you get credibility, but it really takes people's engagement. You actually have to get more than a surface level, giant influencer with Q score or clout said this, I feel that way. If that is going to be the way we engage with these things, you're not going to get very far. And it just goes down to these crazy, explosive sound bites. I want this type of investigation to encourage more of those thoughtful things. And I love that you say that because we view the same way. I want engagement. I don't really care where you end up on this. If we are engaging thoughtfully and listening to each other, we're probably going to get better results and a better just society overall.
I couldn't agree more. And it's a big challenge in society, right? It's not
Yeah.
to your, it's not just
Yeah, it's
relegated
not.
to this
Yeah, it
sector.
feels very, very personal and loud and crazy in crypto, but it's overall.
It's reflective of the evolution of
Yes.
dialogue in society. There you go, right? It's picking up on that
Oh,
evolution too.
it's a whole nother fireside chat.
Yeah.
Sheila, this has been so awesome. I love this. Where can anybody that makes it this far in our delightful dialogue, where can they go to see what you're doing when you drop this ethnographic research? Where can people go to see what the forum's doing in this space?
Yeah, so certainly you can follow me on Twitter. That's really easy. It's at Sheila
Okay.
_Moore, and I tend to give updates there about what we're up to and sometimes do calls for information. We do not necessarily formal RFIs, but like, what are you thinking about this? Or what are people reading on this stuff? We do have a website, of course, weforum.org, and we have there's a lot of stuff on there that's related to these topics, but we have our Digital Currency Governance Consortium that's releasing a gigantic piece of work. It's been almost 18 months in the making, a ton of research that we kind of tend to focus on gap research. It's stuff that no one else is motivated to research intensively, but we think really has the potential to move things forward. That's a group of 80 different organizations that came together and kind of helped us.
Did you say 80 or 8?
80.
Wow. Wow,
Yeah,
that's fantastic.
all of our stuff is massive, right? It's multiple geographies, multiple people across stakeholder sets. So it's got regulators, government, crypto folks, like everybody. It's just a huge, some banks, even like a big consortium of people who came together. That's going to release in October, and that will all come out. It'll be on Twitter. It'll be on all the different platforms we announce stuff. It'll come out on our website. So yeah, there's a lot going on. For our CISA initiative, we're going to be talking more about that in September around the time of the General Assembly. But also we have a summit called our Sustainable Development Impact Summit, where we're going to be making some announcements about CISA and where it is. I'll also note that I'm hiring. So if anyone wants to come and join the team here, I've got a number of roles. And that is probably the most direct way to get involved in what we're doing. Obviously a very different lift than just kind of being aware of what's happening.
Oh, that's fantastic. Thank you so much for this like thoughtful engagement in this space. I really think it's needed. Talk about gap research. I think this is gap effort. This is not where a lot of people are spending their time. So really, I commend what you guys are doing. I think it's incredibly valuable for the world in our space. And thanks for joining us today, Sheila.
I really appreciate that, Rain. Thank you so much. And thank you for hosting conversations like this, because it's so critically important in everything you're doing.
Why, thank you. All right, have a great day and see you soon.
Bye.
Bye.